I didn't read you in the book as being a denier at all, being naive at all, seeing the world through rose colored glasses at all, or asking your reader to do the same. In fact, I read you as saying, this is real, this happens, so you better get ready for it and check your mind. In fact, you say in the book that people with a victimhood mentality are undisciplined thinkers.
Yeah.
I think is how you referred to it, as
Yeah.
undisciplined thinkers. You're not checking your thinking. You're letting somebody else control your thinking. You're not being disciplined in your thinking.
Yeah. Undisciplined emotionally.
Right.
I talk about that as well, which I think is a conversation that's not happening. And I just want to be clear, we're not being condescending to people at all. But I think that people who are undisciplined emotionally are all over the nation right now. I think that this is the problem. I don't think that times are getting harder. I think people are getting weaker in some situations. I think that we're not conditioning and tempering our hearts and our minds to deal with the things that we're facing off with. Victim mentality right now, it's like being in a maximum security prison with no walls. And now all of a sudden we're creating safe spaces and all these kinds of things for people to retreat to because we're not building better people. We're not tempering our emotional thresholds, in the workforce. I mean, we'll check a resume. Where'd you go to school? How did you score on the LSAT, the GMAT, the GRE? But we're not checking emotionally, are people tempered and strong from an emotional standpoint? And so I just think it's a quotient that's not being addressed. We're silent on the issue in society, and we're seeing victim thinking is now becoming the soil from which all of the division, all of the political vitriol, all of the hatred, all of the exasperated racism and the conflagration of emotions in our nation is all growing from the soil, the very fertile soil of victim thinking. And not just in the area of race. I deal with women who have been molested, who've gone through situations where they've been abused. We deal with folks who are dealing with divorce and have gone through bankruptcy. In any situation, victim thinking, it becomes like a maximum security prison with no walls. And my heart is to see people free, to see people liberated, to live in the dignity, to live out the fullness of God's call for their life. And it has everything to do with their perspective and how they manage the emotions. I say that emotions now have become, I use the term emotional EWMDs, emotional weapons of mass destruction. And I think we're seeing that on a cataclysmic scale in our nation right now.
Well, I think you're right about what you're saying. One of the things that really jumped out at me that you said was, if we want to see a better nation, we must start by creating better, stronger people who do not see themselves as victims. And I worry right now when I see what's happening in schools, both K through 12 and in universities, that we are coddling, that we're not preparing students for the real world, because we're, like you said, it's like the prison without walls. We've got students now at some of the top universities in the country, an election result comes back that they don't like, and they're creating safe spaces for them to decompress. We have some universities that have brought in puppies for them to hold so they can not be so anxious. And we have students that are getting tenured professors disciplined, suspended, and fired because they're offended by some of their ideology. I thought we went to the university to hear other people's point of view.
That's correct.
To steel ourselves against things we didn't believe, or to be influenced by something we hadn't considered before. Now, I've seen studies anywhere from 15 to 30% of students think it's okay to yell down a speaker that disagrees with you. And students complaining if they're asked to take the other side of an argument on a final exam, the side they don't agree with. and argue that side to show that they've studied both sides of something. They go to the dean and complain, and the professor winds up getting disciplined or suspended or dismissed. We're not preparing strong people, because when you get out into the dog-eat-dog world where there's a lot of dogs after them bones, you better be tough and ready to go and not whining and being a victim where you say you've been damaged, you say you've been hurt.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think I mean, actually, it's ironic you mentioned the university campus. We're being unintelligent in terms of how we deal with challenges and victimization in life. I mean, a simple premise, and I look at it three ways. There are the facts of victimization, there are the feelings of victimization, and there are the philosophies of victimization. So very, very briefly, the facts of victimization means that you analyze the situations and circumstances that you're dealing with intelligently. But then you also have to ask the question, if I'm being victimized, if I'm experiencing this victimization in my own life, was it some of me and was it some of my victimizer? Was it mostly them, or a little bit of me, or a little bit of me and some of them? When you talk about the facts of victimization, in most situations, when you analyze what actually transpired, it's not as bad as it's augmented. It's not as bad as how you feel it to be. So number one, we have to talk about the facts of victimization and be honest about those and be truthful. John 8:32, from a biblical standpoint, Jesus said you should know the truth and the truth shall make you free. We got to start with the truth and the facts of victimization. Number two, there are feelings of victimization. Now you're talking about my emotional response, which is absolutely subjective, and that can go anywhere in any number of different directions. I think we're encouraging the feelings of victimization. We're not putting any premium on the facts of victimization. And then thirdly, that leads to philosophies of victimization that now is being taught, it's being marketed, it's being politicized, it's being weaponized. And you're now seeing a growing movement that is being pushed in terms of the victim narrative. I think that many politicians have recognized that the greatest political capital in our nation right now is victim thinking. That if you can politicize and weaponize it and make a group of people believe that the other party made you a victim and my party is going to save you from victimhood, it creates a codependency that people will vote and you'll win landsliding elections all day. Now, I'm not speaking to any political group. I'm just telling you the power of politicizing and weaponizing victimization is happening in our society. The facts of victimization, the feelings of victimization, and the philosophies of victimization. And the university campus is exactly where we should be addressing these issues, as well as churches. I think that pastors like myself have a tremendous role to play in how we deal with this.
Well, I think you're exactly right about victimizing. I read an article today from the Wall Street Journal about an analyst saying that that's how Trump got elected, that he came along and addressed a lot of white men who had lost a lot of opportunities over the last 20 or 30 years, that in 1965, there was one woman, I believe it was, in the Harvard Medical School graduating class. It was either one woman or one black. Fast forward like 40 years, and there were like 47, which means there were 47 less white men in that group. So he addressed all of these sort of things that nobody had been saying. And here are all of these guys that are supposedly the ones with a man's world privilege, white privilege, male privilege, who couldn't feel like they were able to whine or complain. And here comes somebody that's whining and complaining for them, and they all jumped on that bandwagon because they wanted to be victims but didn't feel like they could complain. And he gave them the opportunity to weaponize that victimization, and they jumped on the bandwagon. I'm talking to Pastor James Ward, and if you've just started paying attention or listening, he is the author of Zero Victim, Overcoming Injustice with a New Attitude. And the attitude is own your course through this life. Own your feelings, own your thinking, own your choices, that you don't have to step into the victim role. You can reject that. Let me say very clearly, he is not denying that there is systemic racism. He is not denying that there are people out there that will victimize you. He is not denying that there are circumstances or situations that will prey upon you and that you don't have a choice about that. What he's saying is you have a complete choice about what you do about it, what you say to yourself about it, whether you put it on and wear it like a coat or whether you throw it off and say, I'm going to choose how I react to this. Fair statement?
Very, very fair, accurate. Zero victim thinking is preventative. It's preemptive. I use an analogy to describe how victim thinking works, and I use the analogy of baseball. And I like to say that the pitcher is a really, really bad guy because he throws this object that's rock hard at 100 miles an hour at this other guy behind home plate. That's not a nice thing to do. And let's just say that the catcher now on the receiving end of this projectile, this life-threatening projectile that's coming his way, if he is unprotected, unaware, and unprepared, he could easily lose his life with a baseball being thrown at him at 100 miles an hour. But because he prepares, because he preconditions his mind, he takes the proper stance, he puts on the right protective equipment, he stretches out his hand in anticipation of the pitch that's coming his way. And what was potentially a life-threatening situation has now become America's favorite pastime. It's a sport to him. Why? Because he manages the problem that is coming. That is how I describe the necessity of preconditioning your mind to develop a zero victim mindset. The pitches are going to come. The victimization is going to come through relationships, through the work experience. This is something universal. The only qualification you need to be victimized is to be born. It happens to people all over. I talked to a number of folks who are immigrants from other countries who are saying, you don't understand victimization in America when you haven't had a tyrannical government and a dictator. And so it's part of life. The world's a hostile place. But again, the way that we prepare and precondition our minds to deal with those things determine whether or not they have effect on us at all. And that is my encouragement. You mentioned the power of attitude and why I acknowledge the internal discipline, the emotional discipline that's needed. I'll use another analogy. You know, I love college football. I love Alabama football. You know what? It makes me happy when my team wins. You know what? But if my team loses, I'm unhappy about it, but it doesn't rob me of my joy. My joy is separate and independent from whether or not my team wins or loses. So I'm happy if my team wins and I'm joyful. But if my team loses, I'm unhappy. But that doesn't mean I'm unjoyful. What's the difference? Happiness is a result based upon external circumstances, but joy is an internal, unchangeable reality. The same thing is true with freedom. The same thing is true with zero victim thinking. We got to build better people and equip people. I think this should be taught in the school systems. I think it should be taught in churches, that we've got to help folks be equipped to face off with the challenges that we're all facing, and really begin to kind of put this in the right framework.